Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to the Wired for Growth podcast. My name is Michael Pahl. I'm your host today. I'm the founder and CEO at Winona IT. I have a guest speaker here with us today, Amy Mencarelli. Amy, thank you so much for joining us. Do you mind taking a minute to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Michael. I'm Amy Mencarelli. I have been in human resources for 10 years now. I have been in the small business area. I worked for Pillbox here in Warsaw. I've been in consulting, worked in education, and now I'm working for a tech company based out of Indianapolis. So really passionate about HR. I've been in the Warsaw area now for coming up on 15 years and grew up here. So I spent some time here as a kid and I'm glad to be back as an adult now.
What do you enjoy most being in human resources?
At first, I started to get into HR when I was actually getting my MBA.
Okay.
And we had a course on human resources, read a lot of books about it, and HR was just starting to become more data-driven. Mm-hmm. When I thought of HR, I admittedly had bad experiences with HR and generally thought very poorly of the department.
You were in trouble a lot, is what you're saying.
No, I just thought they'd come, hey, we have to have a team meeting and talk about benefits. Felt confused.
Sure.
Felt like, what are they talking about? So I didn't feel like they were helpful.
Sure.
And I felt like when they reached out to you, it meant it was like another thing to do. Mm-hmm. So generally, HR was not on my radar ever as something I wanted to do. And then when I started to read these books and started to see actually HR might be shifting, I was excited about the future of HR.
Yeah.
So that really is what got me into the field, was the idea that it could be better than what I had experienced.
Sure.
And I wanted to be a part of leading that, especially when you look around at the companies in Warsaw. It's very, there are a lot of great people here.
Yeah.
HR can impact your life day to day.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, that's what I want to be involved in. So
that's great.
Yeah.
I guess that leads to one of my first questions, which is just the name HR. We're seeing a bit of a change here. I saw your post on LinkedIn either today or yesterday about, we're hearing human resources. There's a couple kind of trendy titles. Chief People Officer, I think, is one of the more trendy titles that we're seeing more than ever before. What's behind some of the change there?
I think there's just a bad connotation with the word HR. In fact, when I talk to new hires at my company, I always say, we are a people and culture team. That's what we call ourselves.
Okay.
You probably know us as HR, but we want you to think of us in a different light. So when HR first started, it was focused on personnel, administration, very task-oriented things.
Very administrative.
Yes, yeah. And not a lot about the people of what you were doing. So then it shifted to human resources, but that also sounds cold and sterile. It's resources, they're people. I don't know why you think of them that way. And so that, I think, has gotten a bad name.
Sure.
I don't know that people and culture is really a great change, but it's a shift in the direction that the field generally wants to go, which is we're business partners. We're here for people, but the pushback you get a lot on the culture piece is your HR department cannot be your culture champions solely, and they can't change or drive your culture without the rest of leadership.
Sure.
So that's where it doesn't get a ton of love.
Yeah.
I think it's an improvement from HR, partially because you kind of want to get rid of the negative. And so just get rid of the name, and then people hopefully don't associate it. But the people and culture piece, I would say, is still maybe just one step in the right direction, but not necessarily the best.
And you see this trend picking up additional steam, or how do you see it playing out right now?
Well, it's interesting because when you see people argue about it, no one really has a better idea. Mm-hmm. And HR has a different role at every organization, depending on how far along is the organization in their growth. How does their leadership think about HR? Do we think HR is most important to have a seat at the leadership table? Are they a little bit less important, more administrative, just an expense? So it really depends on where an organization is. And for that reason, I haven't seen a lot of great ideas around what I think my LinkedIn post was a joke about could we just be the Wranglers, the Twisters movie?
Sure,
I liked that they were tornado wranglers.
Yeah.
People were throwing out kind of funny people wranglers or whatever you'd like to say. Yeah. I think the one thing I do like about people and culture and that title is it's a little bit more approachable. When you think HR, you think of like, I'm getting fired, I'm getting laid off, I'm getting in trouble.
Sure. Or if not even that negative, certainly the administrative, the paperwork or the review paperwork or what have you. Certainly.
Which is necessary.
Yeah.
But it's not all that HR can do or should be doing for an organization.
You mentioned HR having a seat at the table. It's one of the topics I really wanted to dive in. What might you see in an organization that doesn't have HR representation at the leadership table?
It's probably something you would assume, but people just don't come up in conversation. How's this going to impact our employees? How are we going to handle change management? What's going to be the communication plan? Those things are not top of mind. You know, sales leader, they care about hitting sales numbers. So change management, like, hey, this is what we're doing starting Monday. There it is, the end. So I think the conversation and the nuance that leadership teams have, and when I was in consulting, a lot of times leaders get focused on the process and the outcome they're trying to drive, and they forget that they're needing to bring people along. And so that's one area where I can see HR really helping when they have that seat at the table, is just to remind people like, hey, these are people that we're talking about. You know, you have difficulties on the team. There's nuances, so think through that. But it's also a different perspective that HR should be giving. And part of that onus on HR to be able to lean in at the table is to know a lot about the business. So they need to understand, like, how does sales run their processes? What about your manufacturing floor? Like, what are some issues you've seen there? So they have to be knowledgeable about the business model, its people. It cannot just be like HR in their world, you know, applying theoretical concepts, but you really need to understand the business really well.
No, I totally agree with you. I think just an example, if HR is recommending things that are totally counter to what the business really needs or direction they need to move forward in, I think there's this misconception that HR and the recommendations that come from HR are going to always be sort of counter to progress or financial gains or critical KPIs. I mean, do you see a lot of that struggle?
Yeah, and I think that's when the HR team they basically have their head in the sand.
Yeah.
So, for instance, let's say you and your leaders send out updates regularly. If you have an HR team member, they should be reading those updates. They should be really in tune with what's happening with the business. What were the goals for 2024? Did you meet them? What are the 2025 goals? What are the company goals? Like, those are the filters they should be thinking through. When HR is not thinking that way, it's obvious.
Yeah.
And it's obvious that they don't really have the in-depth knowledge. So then why would you want them to be at the table? There's really nothing more they can add because, I mean, you have a lot of people who have knowledge of their team. So they feel like, hey, I know my people, I know my teams. I don't really need HR. But if HR can help bring everything together and have the HR perspective, the people perspective, and then add in the business perspective, that's where it becomes really powerful.
Is that as rare as it seems, or is that actually more common to have HR teams functioning across all three of those, the spectrum that you just laid out?
I think that's tough to say because I'm not in the room. In my interactions within my network out, you know, on LinkedIn, when I was in consulting with our local KHRA group, I would say this is the direction that everyone wants to head. But whether they know how to get there, have the support to get there, because obviously you cannot just pull a chair up, set it at the table, and say, I'm here. There needs to be an invitation. You need to lean into that.
Yeah.
So I do think that's like the dream spot that every HR team wants to be in. But there is a level of education that I think, just because it is new, level of education that's needed. And that's not just educating yourself as an HR pro, but also educating your organization of like, hey, here's the potential.
Okay. No, that totally makes sense. I want to talk to you a lot about leadership today. Leadership, I'm speaking in general terms here, what are some of the traits that you really look for in an effective leader? And I'd like to know how you've seen human resources kind of foster some of those critical quality traits.
this is a big ask usually
Yeah.
from leaders is like,
Yeah.
hey, senior leaders, we want our managers to level up, help us do that. And it all depends on where the individual is. You
Sure.
have sometimes a first time manager or a manager who has done this for 20 years and is very set in their ways. And somewhere in between that. So the one quality that sticks out to me as being so important is communication. And it sounds so simple, but I was just talking with a friend yesterday about, this is a stat that I thought was crazy. I did not know communication, 7% of it are the words you're speaking.
Sure.
93% is everything else.
That's why I tell people videos on. They got to have your webcam on.
Yeah.
That's
If
part
you're
of
in a
it.
remote setting,
Oh, yeah.
videos on is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
I had not heard that. That 7% seemed so low to me. But when I see leaders that struggle either to build trust with their team,
Yeah.
to get the respect of their team, to get their team to buy in, to get their team to work through change, it's all about communication and how have they been communicating? Are they clear? Are they transparent?
Sure.
Are they authentic? Are they honest? And so it seems like something that we would all think like, yeah, we talk all the time. We're
Sure.
good. We're good. I'm a good listener.
Sure.
Maybe not. But the communication piece, if there's not a solid communicator and
Yeah.
you're in a leadership position, you're going to struggle because
Yeah.
it's so crucial. And it's both verbal and written communication, especially if you're in a remote setting.
How in HR do you come alongside leaders and help with that? And I totally agree. And a lot of the sub-points you mentioned are extremely critical, transparency being one of them.
Yeah.
How do you come alongside and help folks with this?
So in the model of teams that I've seen with HR teams, we normally have HR business partners who partner with our leaders to say, hey, here's some feedback. I'm going to shadow you in this meeting. Let's see how it goes. And then we'll talk about where you could have made improvements. So I think the HR business partner role has really taken on with a lot of companies. They've started to implement that. And there's a high level of accountability for that role.
Okay.
The other area, which we've talked about, is 360s.
Yeah.
So someone needs to understand how they're doing and where there are gaps in order to see, okay, I do need to make improvement. So at first, just getting them to understand like, hey, there is room for improvement here. That's a really big step. And I think that can be tough for leaders to say. And it can be tough, like if you're a senior leader telling your manager that, it can be tough for the manager to believe it because
Sure.
you're just one opinion. And the last thing a senior leader wants to do is be like, well, actually, I have 5 people on your team that have told me this and throw the team under the bus.
Sure.
So that's where HR can help facilitate systems assessments like a 360 to say, hey, here's the data. Now let's talk about it. And then hopefully they have an open mind and are willing to start considering where do they need to improve.
That's great. And I did want to talk today about the fact that you've helped us at Winona IT roll out the 360 reviews. We have a totally revamped end of year review process, which has been hugely successful thus far. I don't know if Scott's been in contact with you yet. The 360 reviews were really interesting. Talk to me a little bit about the value there. You just mentioned a key point, but talk a little bit about the value there and maybe where those can go off the rails too. I know some of ours were a little shaky, but overall we've got tremendous value out of them.
Well, I just had a 360 done on me actually a month ago. I still have the report open in a tab, one of my 50 tabs. I'm sure that makes your IT heart sad. But I have it open because it's feedback from peers and directs of how am I doing? And it's very rare that if I went to someone and say, hey, can you tell me how am I doing? Like in my one-on-ones with my directs, I have a section every week, give me feedback. How am I doing? I've had maybe 2 pieces of feedback I've been given. I think there's just a hesitancy there. But if you can have that opportunity to give a 360 and give feedback, there's going to be a little bit more willingness. And it's also assuming like, oh, I need to get feedback. So this is a good time to state, this maybe this issue or concern. And it doesn't come across as pointed or malicious or vicious for me. It's something where I can look at it. We had to tweak them a little so that they came through in third person, so it wasn't, we didn't want it to be obvious where it was coming from.
Yeah, that can be a challenge.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
one of the downfalls, I
Yeah.
would say. So you need to have an open mindset, but if you're having leaders go through 360s and then all they're doing is looking at that 360 trying to determine who said this.
It's a distraction. It's a huge distraction.
Yeah. So it's that ability to get the right mindset of the person that is having the 360 done on them.
Okay. Yeah.
And then someone from HR, like for us, our business partners, said,
Yeah.
hey, here are your 360 results. Let's talk through it. And so
Okay.
they sat down with every leader and said, okay, here are some really strong things we see. Here's
Yeah.
some areas for improvement, and worked on what's the plan from here.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think the mindset and then that other party to kind of maybe talk you off the ledge a little bit, because
Sure.
it's easy to get wrapped around the negative.
Sure.
And just focus on like that one thing that
Yeah.
really it was hard for you to hear.
Yeah.
Or to filter through, like, you know what, that's one person's feedback. The rest said you all did great in this area.
Sure.
So maybe it's not as big of an issue.
Sure.
Just kind of balance out that perspective.
Do peer reviews tend to be skewed towards, very generous or harsh? The reason I'm asking is, if you look up a product on Amazon as an example, people jump into review something if they've had a wonderful experience or a terrible experience.
Yeah.
And these peer reviews, is there a middle ground, or do they tend to really swing one way or the other?
It depends on the culture of the organization.
Okay.
So if you have an organization, let's say, where there's fear that this 360 is going to impact my job, then I would say it skews towards really generous, because
Okay.
nobody wants to jeopardize someone else's role.
Even if it's somebody who, let's say, they don't get along with, or somebody who they view as detrimental to the team, they still don't want to do that?
So that's where it gets
Okay.
tricky, is where there's a lot that plays into it.
Sure.
And that's where we've seen that some of the 360 feedback, when you run it through AI, it loses some of that nuance, because there is that to
Sure.
consider. But it does come down to the organization, and are you an intellectually honest group? So are you going to give that feedback, even though it might be hard? How will you phrase it? But then also the idea around psychological safety. So it's a phrase that you hear from like Brene Brown,
Oh, sure.
and others will talk about it, but basically saying like, is someone going to be safe if they share maybe some critical feedback?
Sure.
And that really helps that 360 feedback to be much more worthwhile.
Okay. Yeah.
And I would caution against 360s unless you feel like your organization is in a good spot. If the organization is in a chaotic position, leadership, lots of turnover,
Sure.
like I always push back. Like, what's the goal of the 360?
Yeah.
Is there really an honest, good goal there? And if so, do you think your leaders are prepared
Okay.
for it? And do you have a good plan for how to actually share out the results?
In our case, I feel like what we were trying to do is equip our managers and leaders with an additional data point, given the fact that we have a widely distributed team, a lot of remote work, a lot of individual contributors. There was quite a few layers removed between leaders and their direct reports in many cases. Is that an appropriate use in your mind?
Yeah. And I do think you were ready for it.
Yeah.
It wasn't something where someone said on a Monday, let's do this,
Yeah,
and
sure.
Tuesday you launched.
Sure.
There was deliberate
Felt that way
thought.
a little bit.
There was deliberate thought
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
So that's where it was a mature approach. Sometimes you see, hey, why don't we launch a 360? And there's a little bit like, is this a witch hunt for someone? And so that's where
Yeah,
you always need
I
to
can see
question,
that.
like, what's the motive? Why are we doing this?
In our case, I do believe that there were a few folks that we thought would be very, let's just say very standard or average performers, that their peer reviews were relatively unanimous and high. What might be at play when upper management might view an individual as standard or middle of the pack, but their peers really value them a lot? Is it a case where, that just a lot of work behind the scenes, perhaps a lot of back end work?
There could be a couple things at play there. One might be what the upper management is looking at
Sure.
and gauging is different than what peers are looking at. So when I think of a peer relationship, often, I just want you to make my job easy. Can
Sure.
you say yes every time I ask you to do something? That would be great. So
And get it done.
right. So if that's what they are doing, then as
Yeah.
a peer, I love working with
Okay.
them. But as a leader, an upper management, you might say, we'd like to see you push back a little. Like, is this really what's best for the business? And so that's where the peer review can be a little bit different. The other piece is, again, like, well, if they're reviewing me and I'm reviewing them, I want to give them a good rating because I want them to give me a good rating.
Sure.
And that might be subliminally a part of it.
Okay.
Plus, peers tend to be more friends.
Sure.
So you have an aptitude, I think, to just be a little bit more generous in your ratings.
Sure.
Whereas I think you and senior leaders are looking at your team and saying, like, we want you to be the best you can be. And so
Sure.
there's just a higher level of accountability that you have.
That totally makes sense. When it comes to post-COVID, so you've been in HR for, you said, over 10 years now at this point. So you've gone through the whole COVID changes. We're interviewing people from all over the U.S., whereas before we used to be mostly Northern Indiana based. It feels like workers really are more discerning. We recently had a round of interviews where, unbeknownst to us, the candidate that we really wanted to take the job reached out on LinkedIn to 4 or 5 of our employees to say, hey, do you mind if I talk to you about your experience? Which I thought was very interesting.
That is.
I view HR at Winona IT as a partner for helping create a work environment that attracts the workforce that's harder to attract these days. And they have more options available, and they're more discerning. Do you agree with that is a proper place for HR? And if so, what are some ways that you've seen that play out well?
Well, it has been difficult to recruit, especially in technical areas like what you're recruiting for with your team. The compensation was wild during and after COVID for roles like what you're recruiting for.
Yeah.
We're starting to see that come back down now. So that was a difficult piece because we wanted to hire people, and I saw this throughout the sector of just give them what they want, just offer. And now you're looking at what you're paying them, and wow, like we're paying them a lot, and to replace them, it would actually be less. So that was a really big struggle.
Sure.
And what that did too was on talent and recruiting teams, they really had to go outbound. So they had to reach out because so many candidates like in these roles were they're getting bombarded with outreach from recruiters. And so it wasn't like they were on the job postings. Whereas now that's the opposite. So we open a job posting, we might get 700 plus by the end of the day, and we have to shut the posting down.
Wow.
So it's definitely flipped in that regard. And then we've seen the compensation cool as well in a lot of areas. So it kind of pushed HR to get creative when it was very, very competitive, and then also focus on equitability because you don't want to get in a position where you have a solid team in place, you hire in a bunch of new people, bring them in for so much more, and then all of a sudden you're looking at your team and you're thinking, wow, there's a lot of discrepancies here.
Sure.
So that's where I think HR kind of needed to come into its own and have a little bit more of a voice again, like we were talking about earlier, where you have to be comfortable pushing back and saying, hey, your top performer makes $100K. You want to offer this person that you know nothing about 120.
Right.
What are you thinking? Like, what's the thought process there? So you really have to push back because everyone just wanted to fill in the seat. Like, let's get someone in, let's get someone in.
Yeah.
So, but it has shifted, and now
it's interesting.
We're in a position now where it's more. There are a lot of people who need jobs in a few different areas. HR is one of those areas where more people than openings, and so that kind of flips the narrative a little bit. But it's still important to make the right hire to maintain equity, and so all those things that were important back when it was an employee market are just still important in the employer market.
On the subject of compensation, I think this is one of the more difficult things to manage in an organization. I've got leaders that work for me that have only had direct reports for, let's say, a year, or so. And then I've got folks who report to me that have had direct reports for, I'll just say 25 years. Coaching on this topic, on how to manage compensation issues that arise, how to be competitive, it's a difficult topic. How do you coach leaders that are just maybe handling compensation for the first time? What are some of the tips and tricks on how to deal with this, or perhaps some of the guidelines for, hey, it's got to be done a certain way? And I know you're big on equity.
Yeah.
Yeah, help us out. This is hard.
Well, and the reason I'm big, pay equity is so important because when I was in consulting, I would step into some companies where it was completely out of whack, and bringing it back to a middle ground was really, really difficult.
Yeah.
So I think the reason I'm so passionate about it is because I've seen when it gets out of hand and what that can mean, because word spreads.
Mm-hmm.
It's something where you should just bank on the fact that your team members are talking about compensation.
Yeah.
Assume that. But when it comes to leaders, I think having guidelines, you mentioned guidelines, having guidelines in place that are pretty stringent. And when I talk about that, I'm thinking levels, which we talked about with your team, ranges, salary ranges, like very specific. And then talking about how is it that we think about compensation at Winona IT? What does that mean to us? When we talk about it, what does this mean? Is compensation just salary, or is it also bonus? Is it also benefits? Is it also retirement? Sure. Is it the culture? So many different things that it can mean when you think about like a total rewards perspective.
Yeah.
But not leaving it up to interpretation for the leaders. And then again, like we were talking about, hey, a business partner should push back on an offer. Making sure that there's accountability there, so that there aren't just wild offers being made, either really low or really high. But there's, when you look at a team and you look at their performance, where you would expect each team to fall within a range like that, you should be able to do that, a spot check, where you feel good about that. And there are areas within HR where I know, like personally, if something's out of whack, like I'm not going to sleep well at night.
Sure.
And this is one of those areas where it's just so important that there's fairness there.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. I think I've seen some leaders use compensation or perhaps putting together career ladders or progression paths, and on the first swing, it can be too generous. On the first go around. Have you seen that before? Like
the too high in salary compensation?
Or just too aggressive of a progression path laid out. It seems like the temptation on people managing for the first time is something very generous for their team members. It's natural.
Yeah.
But what does it look like? And I know there's a broad range of opinions. If you were coaching a startup today on things like COLA, merit increases, bonus packages, how do you help them make these decisions? What are the questions you ask? How do you get to a good solution here?
Well, when you are starting to plan for that, when you commit to something, you're committed.
Yeah. And very hard to backtrack on anything I just mentioned. Yeah.
So hard because it's expected by the team members. They plan for it in their own personal lives, like timing-wise, percentage-wise, COLA increases. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to get this percentage in January. Well, they might have just bought a new vehicle based on what they expected.
Sure.
And that may or may not be in the company's ability to do, just depending on how the year went. So I think it's really important to think long-term. Like, okay, this is what you want to do, but can you do this for the foreseeable future? Let's say we have another COVID.
Sure.
Is this possible for you to maintain?
Yeah.
Do you want to commit to this? Like, are you committed that if nothing else, you have to give up all these other areas to be able to pay out here? Are you committed there?
And what's long-term, just so we're saying the same thing? Is it 8 years? Is it 5 years?
For a startup?
Well, when you say
24 months.
yeah, seriously. When you say make a decision that you can stick to long-term, you don't mean 2 cycles here. You mean several years.
Yeah. I think you look at how long have you been open? What's the tenure within your team? Like, think 5-10 years. Can we do this?
Yeah.
So that's one piece of it. And then generally speaking, I think most teams most leaders want to reward their performers.
For sure.
So if you have excellent employees, you want to make sure they're taken care of.
Yeah.
To give a blanket, I use the phrase peanut butter spread.
Yeah.
If you want to peanut butter spread your increases across the company, it's easy, it feels good. Everybody gets the same thing. It's
Sure.
cost of living adjustment or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But what are your top performers going to think about that? And are
Right.
you optimizing for keeping top performers?
Because even if you give a merit increase to those performers, it's still watered down and diluted by that across the board sweep most of the time, right? Is that a good way to
Right.
think about it?
Right, yeah.
When it comes to incentive pay, have you consulted with customers that do not offer any variation of a bonus, profit share, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah. I
What's
have.
what's behind most of the decisions not to offer? And let's take out the companies that perhaps temporarily suspending a program like that for financial reasons, or sales are down, that's suspended. Let's eliminate those. Just organizations that are not for incentive pay at all. What's generally behind that?
It's usually, at least with the companies that I've worked with, it's one of two things. It's either they're scared, because the point of incentive pay is to incentivize productivity.
Sure.
So if you aren't confident that productivity is going up, then you're a little bit nervous. But if you structure the program correctly,
Sure.
that solves for itself.
Sure.
There's no payout if there's not an increase in productivity.
It should be self-funded at the end of the day.
Right.
Largely.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The other thing is they've been on the other side of that type of a program, and they don't believe in it.
Okay.
For whatever reason it may be, but there's generally just I've tried it. I was an employee where we did that. It wasn't worth the time, and so they just don't want to.
Okay.
They don't want to invest in it. But it is a big step, similar to thinking long-term about compensation. If you put in an incentive plan, especially if you plan to pay it out pretty regularly,
Sure.
monthly is the most frequent I've seen, but if you
Monthly.
Wow.
Okay.
This was in a production environment, so
Okay,
it
sure.
made sense.
Yeah.
It was a pretty complicated system that they had outside help, not me, someone much more financially adept than me helped them build. Very effective.
Interesting.
Also very generous.
Okay.
And there was a really strong outcome from that. And that was probably the best plan that I've seen as far as incentivizing productivity and
Okay.
seeing a lot of gains from it. But usually it's not a monthly payout. So, but like paying out, if you're going to do it a little bit more frequently, like maybe more than annually, it's just a little bit of nerve wracking. It's a jump to take and
Sure.
to trust that it will have the outcome, because let's say as a leader, you don't structure it correctly and it doesn't fund itself because you didn't think about a human behavior that someone maybe figured out a way to, in which they often do.
Yep.
Figure out a way, a loophole here where I can make those numbers look like what they need to be, but
Sure.
the intended outcome for the creation of it's not being seen.
Okay. Amy, one of the topics I really wanted to talk to you about today is leadership development programs. And we have given this a go at Winona IT. We launched kind of a Leadership 101 program. It was voluntary. We had pretty good turnout. Our idea was having people participate in that weren't on our radar for leadership might have us divert a little attention or just be pleasantly surprised. And I would say that did pan out. I've also seen some other organizations try this and not get the desired results and return on investment they were looking for. What's your overall take? What are you seeing customers of yours do with leadership development programs? Have you seen it done well? I just have a million questions about it. So
There's definitely a historical approach that companies take when it comes to leadership development. I was just talking with a colleague about it this morning, and her direct quote was, "Those approaches are dead.
Okay.
They're not effective." And what those approaches were without like dropping any program names or names of anything, just basically trying to teach a methodology to your leaders.
Okay.
You might have been through some or seen some companies do this type of leadership development. I have leaders at my current organization that have been through multiple different programs, and they've kind of done a pick and choose. Like, I really like this approach the best.
Sure.
So this is how I work with my team based on this leadership development program. We piloted a program this year that was not your traditional leadership development program. It was individualized coaching for each leader. And there was a lot of uncertainty about how it would work out, which is why we piloted it.
Yeah. Is this an internal coach or an external that you brought in?
It's an external coach. We worked with a company that was a startup. And they had a way to match your leaders with coaches that were part of their platform. I was part of the program. So what ended up happening was I was matched with 3 different potential coaches. I interviewed all 3, selected my coach.
Nice.
I'll be having my last session sometime this month, which I guess this month is almost over, so I better hurry up and book that. But it was what I think it's the future of leadership development, because every leader is on such a different level. And so you have to meet them where they are. And the thing about coaching that's really important, and that I felt this company did well, was they said, we're not your therapist, we're not your counselor, we're not here to make you feel good. Like, we're going to push you. And it's not like it was, I mean, it's a great relationship you create with your coach. They just ask you tough questions. That I think a lot of times, like in a company with your supervisor, for instance, and you're one-on-one, these aren't the types of things you're usually talking about with your leader. You're usually talking about, like, hey, how are we doing at meeting our KPIs? What's the plan for 2025? What is your strategy that you're thinking? Not like the coaching, you're diving into how do you show up for your team? Where are the areas where you need to grow as a leader? And so there's a little bit more vulnerability in that relationship. And what I'm talking about with my coach is going to be different from what anyone else is talking about with their coach. So it's a lot more personalized. And the thing I love about it too is you can partner with your executive and say, okay, what are the goals you think I should be working on with my coach? And then it's not just your own perception of where you need to grow. That we did a 360 through this platform as well. So I guess I've had a few 360s done on me this year. That helped inform the conversation. And it was also nice to have it presented by your coach, because you kind of have that safe relationship. But leadership development, I think, is moving towards more of that tailored approach versus, okay, let's bring everyone into a classroom. Here's the model that we follow. Okay, now break up into groups, practice this with one another. I think that's been done a lot. And there are still companies out there doing it, but I have not seen that work or be effective and really stick within a company. And when we did this program, this pilot had 100% satisfaction. And this is where I'm seeing more companies go. It's an investment for sure. But to your point, you can really tailor it to be some of your leaders where you see a lot of potential, or individual contributors where you're like, hey, they are high potential. They weren't on our radar, but they might be one to invest in.
Talk a little bit about, you started off by talking about a certain methodology is kind of dead as it pertains to this. Why? Why is it dying?
Well, it's hard to keep that consistently going in an organization when you have turnover, which we're seeing now. You know, if you get 3 to 5 years out of an employee, generally, that's really strong tenure. I looked at it. I want to say tenure is just over 3 years right now, just broadly speaking in the U.S. So those, like, my in-laws have a lot of friends who got that 50-year anniversary, whatever, plaque from their company. I mean, multiple of them within a small group of like a dozen people. There's at least 3 that I can think of. 50 years they stayed with their organization.
Totally unheard of now.
That's not happening. I don't know. I mean, I can't think. If someone stays over 10 years, that's a lot. 15 is like, whoa. 20 is, so it's just not happening. So when you think about the fact that you should plan for there to be turnover in your leadership team, and then you think about what does it take to train your leaders in this model, and then make sure that they're continuing to utilize it, and then assume they're going to be gone in 3 to 5 years. Okay, is it really feasible? It's expensive. Is it effective? That's the other piece, is like, is it actually effective? And that's where I've seen a lot of leaders say, like, we didn't really see any growth out of it.
No, that's great. It sounds like there's what you're talking about, it sounds like there's a lot more individual ownership too. You're putting in time to that relationship with the coach. You got to select your coach. That's meaningful.
They give you homework,
Which
I know sounds terrible,
Yeah, sure.
but that's where the real growth comes from.
Well, and the accountability from following up on
Yes.
that. That's
Yeah.
good. Really wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of the analytics and data side of HR as well. So seeing a lot on LinkedIn, I think you had a couple recent posts about this as well. What are some of the trends in data and analytics as it pertains to HR? And ultimately, what's the point? Is the point better decision-making support? Or where's it going? I'm just really curious about this.
Yeah. This is an area that we have a lot of room for growth. I think our technology has really improved where most HR teams have access to this data that they're really looking for.
Sure.
But the overall goal is better decision making and real-time decision making. So once upon a time in HR, you might have your HR team present to your board once a month, and the data is from the last 6 months, and it's pretty basic head count, turnover. If you had ENPS was like, wow, they have ENPS. That's great.
Yeah.
Then you saw companies shift to like daily pulse checks.
Okay.
And they use tech for that. So I know of a few companies where, like, when we were in office, when you left the office, you had to answer a question on your way out about like, how was your day?
Interesting.
How do you feel today?
Okay.
Did you feel like you achieved your goals for today? Like whatever the question was. And then they were like, I don't know if you've heard about employees complaining about being over-surveyed.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
That's where that came from.
Okay.
Because there were so many platforms that were like, hey, you need to really understand how your team's doing, like from minute to minute. I think it's somewhere in the middle of that.
Sure.
But being able to, I have a great example of this. Sunday night, one of our sales leaders reached out and was trying to figure out, hey, what did attrition look like 2 years ago when they were not with the organization? I'm curious, do we have the reasons on that? So attrition is voluntary turnover. At least that's how we define it at our org.
Sure.
And they were just curious, like, what were the reasons that people were leaving? They have a dashboard within their access to our system. So I took a screenshot, showed them how to get there, and then showed all the different filters where they could kind of manipulate the data however they wanted. And that's where I think the real power for an HR team comes, is not being the person, because she expected me to hand her the numbers.
Oh, sure.
Because I'm sure that's what she's experienced.
Sure.
But I was
It's probably been harder. That's been necessary in the past for you to hand numbers over.
She sent me the request, and it ended with, if this is too big of an ask, I understand. Which made me laugh, because I was thinking, you're probably 0.5 seconds away from getting it yourself and going way more in depth on the data than you ever expected.
Sure.
So that's where the power really comes for an HR team, because again, back to like, how do we have that seat at the table? Shouldn't just be that we're telling you these are the stats, but then saying like, okay, let's talk about how that should inform your plans for 2025 and your team.
Amy, one of the things that I feel HR is often sort of caught in the middle regarding conflict between managers and their direct reports. Situations tend to maybe boil over, HR gets involved, HR wants to know, how come this hasn't been discussed? There's a lot of conflict avoidance that I think HR has to clean up after. Is that fair? Does that happen quite a bit?
That happens a lot.
Yeah. What advice would you give to newer managers, or perhaps a reminder to seasoned veterans here as it pertains to difficult conversations, meaningful conversations, conflict avoidance, just this whole topic?
So it's probably a recommendation for both new leaders and HR professionals. You're on the same team. So build a relationship. Whoever the leader is, who's your HR counterpart that you should be reaching out to? Get to know them, build a relationship, and be having these conversations regularly. Because if you bring HR in at the end, a lot of times this is what happens, and this has happened to me many, many times in my career. Manager reaches out, hey, I have a team member I need to fire tomorrow. Didn't even know the team member was not doing well. And at that point, HR has the liability and risk at mind. Like, they want to protect the organization.
For sure.
The manager's trying to optimize for the team being the most effective. So it feels like they're up against each other. You're really trying to achieve the same thing. Had the manager flagged whenever the situation started, way back when, to HR, to start saying, hey, I need help thinking through, I need help working through this situation, it's very likely you wouldn't be at the position you're at today where you're saying, hey, I need your help to terminate this person in 24 hours. So I understand, and I understand that not every HR department has maybe the capacity or the relationship with leadership in this way that they should. So for HR pros that are not this way, I really, really encourage you start building that relationship with managers, rethink what you're doing. You're a business partner to the organization and these leaders. Be that partner to them.
Sure.
But then for leaders, don't be scared to bring it to HR, because I can guarantee you they'd rather hear 6 months ago that there's a problem that's starting to kind of concern you. Yeah. And they'd rather talk through proactively, how can we address it, versus if you come to them and say, I need your help to terminate tomorrow, it's probably not going to happen. It's not going to work out the way the manager wants. And HR certainly doesn't want to be brought in to fix this situation. They would have rather have said, let's try to coach and work through this with the employee.
Sure. No, that makes total sense. I wanted to ask you your opinion on something that I've been doing a lot of reading on. So at Winona IT, we have billable resources. I know like an attorney's office is a classic example where they're expected to get a certain number of billable hours. This can de-incentivize things like on-the-job learning or leadership training. I want to attend this leadership training, or my one-on-one coaching, like you talked about earlier, but I have to get X number of hours out this week. How do you, as an organization, how can you overcome that and satisfy both requirements?
Well, so when I was in consulting, it was a billable hours requirement. Yeah. So there's a couple. First off, it's the team member's job to care about their career.
Sure.
So if that means, like for me, sometimes that meant that I needed to go to a conference and sacrifice 4 billable hours in the afternoon, which that's precious time.
Sure.
But what's the ROI on that? What it made me do was be way more discerning about the training I went to.
Yeah.
Versus like, oh, that's a great webinar, I'll just pop in.
Sure.
That was not how I thought. It was like, if I'm not going to get value out of it, I'm not sacrificing the billable hours.
Which is great.
Yeah, it did. It helped me really hone in on like what truly is valuable, who are the valuable vendors, figure out like what, if I get an invite from this organization, probably not worth my time, just going to move on.
Yeah.
The other thing is the organization doing something to help maybe modify what the billable hour requirements are or give a little bit of wiggle room? Some leaders are really excited about that, see it as a benefit.
Yeah.
Some would say like, nope, this is on your time. This is the expectation. We're not gonna mess around with that. Yeah. Within billable hours, it can be, maybe there's grace for if you don't hit it for the month, you have the whole year to be able to hit your goal.
Sure, you can get caught up later.
Yeah. So I think there's ways for leaders to get creative, but I don't think it's just on the company.
Sure.
If an individual needs the company to pay for it, make time for it, all of that, they're really not invested. And ultimately, you're not going to go anywhere in your career if you're not the one driving it. And you need to be the driver of your own career.
Sure.
So I do think the onus falls on the individual and being discerning about that and having the drive. But then there probably are areas within a billable hours framework where you can be a little bit flexible.
Yeah.
But not to the detriment of the company, because obviously you have to think about the bottom line.
For sure.
And so
financial returns do have to ultimately be prioritized in business. Yeah, I totally get that. During your consulting engagements, what do you often see as a couple red flags that, hey, culturally some things are definitely off, or perhaps worst case scenario, culturally things are really going downhill? What are some red flags that are common themes?
Usually I'm in a room with the owner or the president or CEO and their leadership team, and it's pretty easy to tell quickly, even before they've spoken, just body language, where people sit.
Sure.
No pressure.
Yeah.
Where people sit, how
Yeah.
they interact before like a meeting has officially started.
Okay.
Is there like joking around?
Sure.
You can tell a lot
Yeah.
from, and let's say everyone's in the room except for the leader, the president.
Okay.
How does the room change, or does the room change at all when the president walks in?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
So that's generally where I think those are usually the meetings I've been in, where that's the group I'm with. But the other piece of that is a lot of companies will be interested in stay interviews, so you can get information from current employees on how are things going, and so that's where you can also dive in to see, are things as they seem.
Okay. Interesting. When you, let's say, you're engaged for a couple months, and let's say that company was really off the rails for whatever reason, things are starting to get better. What do you generally associate with a positive upswing from a cultural perspective? Is it, because it's easy for me to say, oh, it's retention, or it's these metrics we're all accustomed to, but I think people can stick around at bad jobs that pay really well, for example. That's not really, I don't know. What are some of the things you see when things get back on the right track?
I think employees want to feel like they're winning.
Mm-hmm.
So they need to win, whether they're winning in their paycheck. Like you mentioned, it's a
Sure.
bad job, but they're getting paid well. To some who, but depending on what they're optimizing for, like that's a win.
Sure.
I
Sure.
love my paycheck. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll stick around. But more often than not, employees want to win at their jobs. Like they want to do well and feel like when they leave, like I'm good at what I do.
Yeah.
So being able to not only get those wins for team members, but then celebrate them
Sure.
and make sure that that's communicated. Like, hey, the company's doing really well, or this department just had a great month.
Yeah.
Highlighting it. I know.
Momentum is really a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And making it really evident. A lot of, like we talked about, the culture piece cannot be borne by an HR team or
Sure.
a small group. It needs to be emanating throughout the organization. So it does start at the top, and that needs to be authentic. So generally, when you see like a toxic environment, the values and what you say the company stands for and what actually are the lived values, if those are at a dissonance, then you're going to see that it's a negative culture.
Sure.
So that's the other thing is deciding, like, are these really our values that we care about? Do we live these values? Is this what we want to say is who we are and what we're striving to be?
Yeah.
And making sure that those are aligned, because you mentioned employees are really savvy.
Sure.
They are.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
if you
yeah.
say these are our values and then you turn around and
Yeah.
totally contradict them, it's going to be obvious.
Yeah, for sure. What are some of the really common misconceptions that leaders have working, with HR? I know one that you've alluded to is that HR needs to kind of set and govern the culture. That's way too overly simplified. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. But what are some other big misconceptions?
Even within the last couple months, I had an employee be like, "Hey, so and so did this. You need to talk to them."
Yeah.
Like the police officers
Yeah.
of the organization, or like someone broke this policy. You need to fix it, or we need to change this policy because it's not effective. It's really that idea that HR is there to enforce rules.
Yeah.
Create rules and enforce them, and the end, that's what they do. I think that was, like, when I started in HR, that was really pretty common. Like
Yeah.
that was not just how the role was perceived, but it was how it was actioned as well.
Yeah.
So that has shifted, but it's a slow shift. And
Sure.
I'm sure there are still some HR teams out there that operate that way, but
Yeah.
generally, like, kind of police officer, or if an inappropriate joke is made and someone says, like, "Oh, HR's in the room, we
Yeah.
shouldn't have said that."
Every HR professional hates that comment, don't they? It's like the bane of their existence.
Yeah, we're not,
Yeah.
trust us. Like, we like to laugh too. We're not here to police everyone. And
Yeah.
that is something where I think it's carried forward with the profession, and
sure.
that's not who the team is. And then, and when I say that's not who HR is, like, I think that's the essence of where the majority of HR professionals want the profession to
Sure,
head.
sure.
But then also not being a paper pusher, I think that's a perception a lot too.
Okay.
Like you're here to do new hire paperwork, performance paperwork, pay us, benefits. If we leave, you do all that paperwork and like that's what you do.
Sure.
With all the technology now, that a lot of that is automated.
Yeah.
I
Yep.
mean, I haven't touched paper in so long.
Yeah.
It's all done digitally.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that has really fallen away, and for good reason. Like that is
Okay.
very tasky, and that's not where HR is.
Sure. No, I totally get that. Yeah, one of the questions that I wanted to get into, we have a lot of, so on our support team, we have a lot of folks who are transitioning from other industries to IT. Our support offering does give people an into the tech side of business. A lot of younger folks on that side of the business. Doesn't require tons of work experience. The younger generation, they do have different values. It does seem to change every, few years. How can HR help an organization deal with different values and different generations of their workforce? You got to blend it all together into one company culture. What are you seeing there?
It's like the problem that will never go away.
Yeah.
When I started in HR, it was, millennials. I just cannot stand working with millennials.
Sure.
And now, not only are millennials one of the biggest elements of the workforce, but generally they're pretty well perceived.
Sure.
Millennials they don't have the reputation they used to have because now we have Gen Z.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a lot of thoughts about Gen Z.
Yeah.
And the no matter what your opinion is, if you want to have a successful business, you need to understand that there are going to be lots of generations represented in your workforce.
Mm-hmm.
To cater to a particular generation, that's not wise because you're going to have representation from everyone.
Sure.
And so you cannot say, forget Gen X, forget the boomers, we're focusing on Gen Z, unless that's your business model and that's what you're looking to do. But for most companies, that is not the case, and they need to be sure that what they're doing is relevant for all different generations. So you don't want to overcorrect because the generation is constantly shifting, the generational mix in organizations. But that being said, the thing with Gen Z that is unique that we haven't seen before is the desire to have flexibility, and not flexibility in the idea of like, I want to take my lunch break when I want to take it. Flexibility in the idea of like, hey, I want to work here, but I also want to build my personal brand and
Sure.
have a side hustle and maybe try to have a product that I sell. I mean, there's a lot of different ways. And if you read about it, they say Gen Z grew up watching all these companies lay off their parents.
Oh, sure.
And they saw, the different financial crises we've been through. They watched COVID happen.
Yeah.
So they see the fragility of relying on a singular job.
Sure.
And so they're really savvy, and they want that opportunity to have like a portfolio of this is, my income isn't dependent upon one employer, but there are multiple areas where my income is coming from. And obviously we're not at a point where Gen Z is the majority of the workforce, but I think what it is saying is the work model is shifting. It needs to shift. And you need to be aware of it and planning for it.
Yeah.
It's not like to say, hey, in 2028, it's going to be different for everyone. It's different for every company. It's different. I mean, we're in Indiana. I think that type of stuff is a little bit slower in the Midwest, where the coasts might feel it a little bit faster and sooner.
Yeah.
But I do think that that's something to be really aware of and watching what are the trends. And then starting to think through, like you mentioned, Winona IT was so focused on hiring in the area, and now you've expanded.
Right.
And that was because you wanted to compete for the best talent.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you're looking to compete for the best talent, what is it that talent is looking for, and how can you think more creatively? Like the traditional approach is, okay, we have a job opening. It's 40 hours a week, full-time, benefits, 401k. Well, with Gen Z, what if they wanted to be fractional and come on for project work? Are you open to that? Would that satisfy your need? It'd probably be cheaper for you.
Right.
So kind of sitting back and thinking like, what are actually my needs as a company, and what are the potential asks I'm going to have, and how can I be more fluid in that regard? Maybe it doesn't happen this year, next year, 5 years from now, but being aware and ready so that you're not caught in a position where
Scrambling,
COVID hits, and March 13th, we all go from meeting in person to we all have to figure out how to work
Right.
and meet in Zoom.
Yeah.
How do you make sure you're ready? It's not going to be that sudden of a shift, but
Yeah, sure.
at least starting to think that way.
That seems really smart. Amy, as we're wrapping up today, just one last question here for the listeners. What's one piece of advice that you would offer an emerging, HR professional who's really striving to influence decision makers? And I'd also like for you to give just one piece of advice for a seasoned HR professional who's really wanting to partner with management and leadership at their organization more effectively moving forward.
Good question. Really personally, like thinking from my own experience, I would say that you need to see yourself in a different light and the value that you bring to the organization before others are going to believe that. So if you think of yourself as HR, we process paperwork, we field questions reactively, that's how you're going to be perceived.
Sure.
So I'd really challenge HR pros to think about not just who am I, but who do I want to be as an HR professional, and how do I want to present myself, and lean into that. You're going to have to push yourself. You're going to get uncomfortable. It's not going to be easy, and you may not have seen it exemplified. I think that's the hardest part.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it done, you're not really sure how to do it.
Yeah.
And so that can be really, really difficult. But you have to have that mental image in order to become that. And a lot of times you hear people say like, well, find a really good mentor, build a good relationship with other leaders. And I think if you have that opportunity, take it, but not everyone does. That's a gift when you have that.
Sure.
And HR tends to be a little bit more removed in the sense that they need to be unbiased. And so sometimes those relationships, you want to build them really strongly, but there's also boundaries. So in the absence of a really strong mentor or coach or those strong leadership relationships, have that internal confidence and sense of where you're headed and who you want to be and how you want to present. And then for leaders on the opposite side who are trying to say like, how is it that I partner with HR in a better way? Give them the chance to fail. So some of the things we've talked about today, I think that might be a little bit of a jump for some leaders to see HR in this light. Just try. See, put that challenge to your HR leader, to your HR team. See if they have the potential or the eagerness or even the aptitude to get there. And that can tell you a lot about whether this is possible. But it's definitely like there needs to be an opportunity given, but HR needs to step up. And I think that comes first with like, how do you view yourself internally and what is it that you think you're capable of, and then go after it.
Oh, that's great advice. Great advice. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciated having you on.
Yeah.
I know we covered a broad range here, but I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And I just want to thank our listeners for tuning in. Look for us next time on Wired for Growth.